It feels if we would just shut up and help each other instead of compete, things would be better. What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, a lot of times in the
Mhm.
startup space, we think about competition against the established corporations, right? Like the David versus Goliath, we want to
Exactly.
compete,
Brother
but
against
you're more
brother.
framing this as, startup against startup, brother against brother. Not good. Yeah, I understand why that is saddening, but I also think it's almost in pursuit of figuring out what works.
Mhm.
How can I offer the best solution against my, counterparts to prove that we're on to something here. So I think some degree of it is healthy, but I hear what you're saying that maybe if you find a model to bond
Exactly.
together,
I from
you
my own
might have
experience, like
more
early
success more
while I was still
quickly
in college
against the
working on
big guys.
Lumastic, like right in the first year that I was working on it, there was another founder in kind of our same like startup community at the university who essentially launched the exact same product that I had been working on with, yes, very similar like name, design, style, like used the same
Really?
like leitmotif that I was using throughout Lumastic's design concept. And at the time, some people, like Sarah in particular, felt like that was very not right. I was unfazed. Like I was me, right? And my goal had always been like, I want this problem to be solved more than I want to solve the problem. And if somebody else wants to try to tackle it, sure, it's good to get other ideas and perspectives. And maybe something will be sparked in me because of that. But the more I started thinking about it now, the more I'm thinking about how that was such a waste of an opportunity where I could have gone to this person and said, hey, because we never talked about it. Like, but I could have gone to them and said, hey, I noticed you're now working on something very similar. Do you want to share notes or something? Or is there something I can do to support you or tell you what I've learned? Or even do you want to work on this together? It's so interesting that there's such a culture, I feel, in the startup entrepreneurial community of having like ownership and like making sure that the idea in your head is fully controlled by you in terms of its execution, that people don't want to cross pollinate and collaborate often. And also, there's this whole culture of everyone's looking for a co founder. And it feels like these things are deeply intertwined. But do you have any like experience with something similar or something from your own experience, like startup experience?
I don't have an experience quite like that
Hmm.
where I was kind of rubbing shoulders with someone doing an extremely similar venture. But recently I've been having conversations with
Cool.
two founders in particular who got their start as intrapreneurs, where they pretty much built a product with a salary at a larger company. And I'm very fascinated by
Hmm.
it. And I'm curious, like, I don't think there is a playbook, let's say, for this. But I wonder if there is a thing you could try as an entrepreneur that's similar to joining forces with a company that is offering the same service, but just in the same problem space and saying, hey, you already have some traction doing this
Hmm.
with my target users. Could I come in and enhance your value to those customers with this additional solution? Seems kind of like a stars have to be in perfect alignment. But I'm curious if there's a pitch for either partnership or
Yeah,
intrapreneurship
exactly. And I think
in that
there
way, which is,
are some
collaborative.
comparables to that, but most of them happen maybe not like internal to creating like new product. It's more new product starts and then there's the whole acquihire concept, right? Where most acquihires are not so
Mhm.
much because
Yeah.
big company sees threat, but because big company sees new market opportunity. Even just this week, Notion had their
Yeah.
Apple-like event that all these startups are doing now, where they launched like Notion Mail, which was, I can't remember what company they acquired, but they acquired some mail client that was focused on like privacy and organization and all that stuff. And Notion, I think, internally could have built a mail client, but instead they just shopped for one and got one and brought it in. And I'm sure that conversation could have started with
Yeah.
Notion reaching out to company to say, we'd like to buy you. I think more often it seems like what happens is there's a familial connection in venture capital firms, right? Where like startup is invested in by VC firm that invested in Notion, and they see that this mail client app is like running out of money or isn't going to be a big enough market or whatever. And so they put them in touch and say, hey, would you buy this company? Yeah, that's some inside baseball. But that's how it happens.
That does sound, yeah. It's interesting because in the startup world, I don't know if, when you do make that acquisition or an acqui hire, it's not like both companies are thriving. Like you said, one, I don't know if we should even speculate if I don't know, but if we say I don't know anything, but Notion Mail, the mail service provider they acquired, if it was failing, wasn't profitable, but just kind of had some bones, right? Some positioning maybe, that's going to be a cost on Notion. So is that something that, how do you pitch that, I guess, if you're the founder of this unrelated service provider, goes with the same target market or target user, how do you pitch that acquisition?
I don't know. I feel like,
without the VC, it's
trying to think
weird
about
that
what
does
the
happen. Maybe it doesn't happen.
outlook or incentive or positioning would have to be because in general, if your company is doing well, there's no reason to like sell internally. Now, if you're internally at some company and you think that there's this new product area that you want to go into, I think that's an easier sell, depending on how big your company is and resource management and all that stuff. But if you're at a 200-person startup and you've got some pull with some product person and you've got some data to back up that these series of customers would really benefit from moving into this area, or like you're now at the size where you can start like expanding to some like parts of the like product landscape that your competitors already solve, that's an easy move. I think what's the more interesting part to me is like where this becomes, hey, we're going to integrate instead of compete, right? Rather than stand up a competitive product, we're going to, combine forces in some way. There's some symbiotic relationship between our products that I think makes sense. That's something that we never got to at Lumaster. We were just using public APIs from a lot of like more established companies, but I've seen cross collaborations even between one that I'm exploring currently between the company called PowerSync and Supabase, which are two development products. But PowerSync is basically a sync service between a mobile app and the database, and Supabase is a giant database company. And like Supabase could definitely make their own sync service for this stuff, but instead they decided to partner with PowerSync. And at Sanity, where I work, we have some partnerships that I have no idea if I'm allowed to talk about it or not, so I'm not going to get into too many details, but it is interesting to go into those conversations and you're really weighing the build versus buy versus collaborate, befriend, build versus buy versus befriend. That's what we're going to call it.
Yeah. What do those partnerships look like? Because it's risky to actually acquire another company where from my perspective, it seems like if one is weaker, it's going to, not only is there the cost of acquisition, but there's the cost of actually getting them over the finish line. And that like the sell of, we're going to increase your potential with this new capability. Great. But you haven't delivered on that yet. So I'm going to buy you, and then instead of building something from scratch in-house.
And that's why I think a lot of these acqui-hires end in products just being killed.
I don't know. It seems risky. I don't know.
Right. Where they've mostly hired for, I think they've hired for team.
So I see the same thing.
They've hired mostly for team.
What
That's
is
the hedge
the right
of the bet they've made. And like, again, we're not talking about these like acquisitions where like Albertsons is merging with Kroger. Like this is a completely different world. Yeah, this is more like exactly what I talked about, this VC family tree, right? But that's really, really how it happens so often. And like the weird thing about that, just to like re-explain it better, maybe. There are a lot of acquisitions that happen because a VC has a portfolio of two companies. One company is almost on the verge of insolvency. They haven't figured out the product market fit, they're bleeding cash, or the market has just been seen to be smaller than the VC originally thought. And so what they do is they go to a portfolio company that's doing better and has more cash and say, hey, would you be interested in acquiring this other team that we've groomed and grown into your company? There might be a market opportunity. There might be a similar like kind of domain expertise, whatever it is. And more often than not, because of the incentives of all of these people, and the power dynamics at play, the larger company will say yes. And then basically there's an acqui-hire of employees, sometimes of technology, but really often it's not going to work that way. And then what happens is the VC firm puts out this big press release that says, hey, one of our portfolio companies got acquired by this other company. Isn't that crazy cool? But what you don't see, yes, success, but what you don't see behind the scenes is really all the money just went back into the VC firm. They used their own money to buy their own money back. It's the most weird, incestuous kind of pattern of behavior that makes all of these firms look like they're more successful than they actually are. Yeah, very strange.
And we're in a high risk space, right? So, it's hard out there. I under the incentives at play.
Henry, the thing that I really wanted to talk about in this section of the podcast was like, as we think about competing versus collaborating, integrating, buy, befriend, build, what are like the pros and cons, right, of working competitively in our startup landscape versus working collaboratively? And as you mentioned at like the start of this conversation, the argument for competition is usually that in capitalism, like competition is like praised because even larger firms have to compete to stay relevant. They have to continually reinvent themselves. It's the whole idea of creative destruction. That's what propels progress. In a competitive landscape like that, there isn't free movement of knowledge, since the firms with knowledge usually try to prevent other people from getting like their trade secrets and stuff. And so that's the thing that's trying to give them a competitive edge. But that's the thing, that free movement of knowledge is actually what sparks innovation, right? Like you see somebody doing something interesting, you can adopt that, improve it, and then implement it yourself. Someone else does that for you all the way down the line. That's why it's so interesting to compare this competitive landscape to the amount of rapid progress in open source development. Thing to add on the why we usually praise competition side before I talk about a different framework? Do it.
I guess what comes to my mind is a bit of a tangent, so I hate to derail, but I think it's sort of relevant. We think about innovation as kind of a product of competition, but I think more and more business schools are starting to teach that innovation just comes from being close with your customers. Like the reason that Facebook was more successful in launching a social media company than a established huge corporation with way more money, way more brain power is because they were on college campuses, they were with the people, closer to the customers, could build something that was
also
sticky.
They got to see what other
you see that time and time
social
again,
platforms before them had done,
startups.
And that they would do better. So I think that part of it.
And so they had access to that information and could be, boots on the ground, where it's a little bit difficult for a large corporation to kind of go back to the foundation and prove something in the field. And so I think if you can collaborate with another startup or another early stage company at that level where you are at the foundation level, that's a perfect opportunity. The further away you get from the foundation, harder it is to innovate. Is kind of what I see. It becomes
confusing to me why we focus so much on talking to founders about like how to think about competition, right? There's so much right now about don't think about your competition, right? That there's some moral strength in just focusing on what you're doing and not caring what other people are doing. And if you're looking at what other people are doing, then that means you're behind. Like that whole metaphor about if you're looking at your competition, it means you're behind your competition. Like this all seems like hogwash to me, right? Yeah, because the
Yeah, I'm
looking
not
at
sure if
what
I'm drinking
our
that Kool-Aid,
like
but same as
peers are doing,
yeah.
right? Let's even stop using the word competitors. Like looking at what our peers are doing is what helps us get new ideas and innovate, right? Like that idea of putting yourself in a hole and not thinking about your competition, I think is wrong. I also think that the opposite of being hyper focused on trying to always be positioning yourself based on what everyone else is doing is also wrong, right? And the comparison I think to make that I think would be helpful for founders is think about how artists do this, right? All your favorite musicians love listening to music, and they're not all just listening to their own music. Like you'd think those people would be crazy, and if they just listened to their own music, right?
Yep.
They listen to a broad variety of other artists to try to get inspiration and create their own style, right? The emulation of other artists is usually how new artists start. And then because they just gain a larger perspective, just because we all have unique thoughts and ideas and like things we're attracted to, you eventually develop a style that is unique to you. And that's also true, I think, of products, right? Like you develop a unique perspective about how things should be solved, how things should be designed, like the things that you care about in terms of your relationship with your customers and what they're looking for. And that helps you develop your own unique style. But you can't get there by just sitting in your own head and and not taking in any other outside perspective. There's another story I want to tell, if you'll let me, of that we think about
Please.
our economy as everybody's their own kind of competitor, and you might be looking at somebody else, but you're not really talking to them. Like you're both, there's this whole thing of corporate espionage where you're trying to gain information from your competitors without them knowing and all this stuff, all this secrecy. About 1,000 years ago, like there was a completely different like world being lived in like ancient Venice. Basically what was happening in the 13th century of Venice is that glass was like the AI of the day. Everyone was like so freaking into glass, like manufacturing, like cups and glasses and like portraits and all these things. But Venice was built out of wood. And if you know anything about wood, it burns really easily. And if you know anything about glass, you need really hot ovens to make glass, like 3,000-degree ovens. And 3,000-degree ovens and wood don't mix very well. And so Venice constantly was in a state of burning, like literally on fire. We talk about hair on fire problems, right? Venice was literally in a hair on fire problem. And the government of Venice saw this and was like, okay, we need to do something about all of these glass manufacturers all over the city. They're doing great stuff, but they're burning the city to the ground. We, as the Venetian Council, are actually going to declare that all glassmakers in Venice now need to move to Murano, which is like an island in the middle of the Mediterranean. This is for the safety of the public, all that stuff. Murano at the time was just a fishing village, basically. And so all these glassmakers are forcibly moved to this island. All of their like servants and like children and everybody's moved here, and they have to basically build like an entire city version of an accelerator where there's a common space to do the glass blowing. There's shared resources in terms of, like they need a school and like all these things. And what starts to happen over the next 100 years is there's like a dramatic increase in innovation in glass manufacturing, because what once was a competitive landscape with a bunch of people scattered around, now they're all centrally located and they have to share resources. And not only did this help innovate in terms of the technology, it also innovated in terms of the social technologies that were created, including one of the first glass-making guilds, with like creating all of these like safety rules that all the glass manufacturers said they would follow, all of these rules about like how much you got paid for your work, all these things. And what I find really fascinating about this story is like a lot of historians believe that without this moment, like the amount of glass artwork, like beautiful glass artwork production that happened during the Renaissance would not have happened. And it all happened because instead of thinking about each other as competitors, they had to think about each other as peers, as collaborators, as friends, as like your community. And I feel like they were all now one company. They're all still individual proprietors, But I feel like if we could do that more for us as entrepreneurs, think about each of our industries less as like we're all in a competitive area and more like we're all kind of one community working on trying to make something cool happen. I feel like there would be so much more innovation than just thinking about each other as the enemy or competitors. What do you think about this story, Henry?
I love this story. I think it's so cool to see kind of collective innovation take place in the real world. I'm trying to envision what this might look like in a particular industry. Like, this is a bit of a meme example, but would you want all the rideshare startups to kind of get together and talk? Like, would a software version of this make
So I
sense,
think
or
it's really good to think about
only a physical
comparables, about
product,
what are
like a
the
car or something?
artifacts that are created from this collaboration. And I think when we think about software, the artifacts that usually are created are like open source libraries. So if we take Uber and Lyft, for example, because of Uber and Lyft, there has been like and some other companies, but just to follow your train of thought, there's been a lot of innovation, you'd say, in like map rendering technology, because now there are so many more apps that needed to create custom map features. And we probably wouldn't have had that without the massive amount of infrastructure, R&D and development into kind of companies like Uber and Lyft. And you start to think about, okay, if you had an accelerator where instead of right now where accelerators like have a theme, but they don't have any people that are working on the same thing. And there's often like you might get rejected from an accelerator because, oh, we have a portfolio company that kind of does something similar, blah, 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 blah. What if you were like, okay, we want all of the people that are making personal project management software, and to think about how much more might be able to get done if there's a sense of shared resources in terms of we're not all going to do all the same stuff repetitively. That's really inefficient. Instead, we're going to make stuff, create an artifact that's usable by the rest of the community, but we're still all like selling separate things, having different like styles and approaches, just like we've talked about with the perspectives, and see what happens. I think it'd be so fascinating to do that.
I agree. I can kind of see the vision there. I feel like things holding us back from that utopia are perhaps a softer version of greed, or I'm not, trying to say this is a horrible sin, but the idea of I'm an individual, I want to pursue this business the way I want to. I want to, keep my intellectual property. I want to, keep my secrets to myself so that I can make money, sell the business, become rich and famous, whatever. I feel like that's something holding us back. But also maybe there's a conversation to be had about what does differentiation, like if we think about dating apps, the underlying technology is the same. So the execution of matching lovers is not, the biggest technical challenge. Could there be shared innovation to make that better if everybody works together? Yes. But the actual differentiation between dating apps is more subjective.
Go-to-market strategy.
Right? It's in the branding, it's in the positioning, it's in the, niche markets that they serve. Yeah. And so, could you still have those like in ancient Venice where I'm doing different glassware and you're doing windows, but we're kind of working off the same technology and practices and regulation? Yes. I'm following, but that's also regulated by the government. And so I'm curious, like, do you think that utopia could exist without force? And I think the obstacles to that are the greed.
Yeah, I think that is a great summation of like why we don't see this happen as often today. We don't have the world is burning down, so we need to move you all to an island situation going on. What I think is an interesting comparable is
the demand.
Projects like, Manhattan Project, the development of NASA, the development of the internet, right? This does happen in academic circles more often than like business circles, even though you could say that academics and companies are in similar incentive structures where the whole publish or perish phenomenon and you want credit for this development and all that stuff. Like So it's interesting to think about how in those cases too, like the obstacle is like the incentives of the people with money, like the government incentives, which were the people with money, right? Where we need to develop this type of technology, right? And so we're going to gather all these people that are working on similar things together in order to make that happen, right? What's interesting is that I feel like VC industry, startup industry should have a similar incentive, right? Where like they know that rising tide lifts all boats. And if we can get more of you together, this actually goes back to a similar conversation around like how acqui-hires usually work, then maybe you'll have a greater chance of success of actually developing this thing that we need. But whether or not, yeah.
I see that. I totally see that. And from a venture capitalist or an incubator or an accelerator standpoint, if they could get more brain power, that will increase the likelihood of success. Totally agreed. I don't think anybody's going to push back on that. But I think that this reality only comes to fruition if all these founders say, I'm okay with not getting written a $2 million check. I'll just take a piece of this pie or a salary to join this almost like a think tank to, master this new technology or this new industry or this new problem. Right. That I don't see a huge demand for. Like, these are entrepreneurial people that are in the same problem space. Unifying them isn't going to be easy. That isn't going to be just post a job, from a VC saying, we'll pay you, everybody come together and collaborate on this idea. It seems like those people don't want a job. They don't want to join a collective.
Yeah, exactly.
They want to be on their own
thing.
And they want to get rich solving a problem.
I think that the cognitive dissonance that we might have to overcome there is that it's far less likely that you can do it without the help of other people. And maybe in some ways, it would be better for us and for maybe the greater progress of the world to let go of some of that more lowercase greed incentive and work with each other more. Build bridges, not moats. But, Henry, we have other things to talk about. If anybody has other thoughts on that, please leave us a comment down below.
Good.
And if you're listening to this, you can pop over to YouTube and leave us a comment.